So my name's Helen. I'm actually based in Newcastle, up in the north of England, and I've been a tutor for Kaplan since 1997. So I'm coming up to my, I think, 28-year anniversary very shortly. And in that time, I've been a tax tutor, and I also work within the content team for Kaplan. So I help to produce their tax materials. And when I'm not working for Kaplan, I like to do some of these webinars and some topic explainer videos, that kind of thing for ACCA. So today's session, the idea of this is we're going to have a look at the most recent examiner's report. So I'm going to pick out some of the key points from there, things that you really do need to know, really important things to help you to get through the exam. We're also going to have a little look at the study hub. So I'll do a bit of a demonstration of the study hub to show you what you might find useful there. We're going to run through some exam strategies as well. So just a few practical tips to help you in these last couple of weeks. What do you need to be doing before the exam? And there will be a chance, hopefully at the end, to answer your questions. So if you do have any questions, if you pop them in the Q&A panel, then I'll have a look at as many of those as possible when we get to the end of the session. So to start with then, we have the most recent examiner's report. So this is the one from the September-December exam sittings. So we don't get all of the exam questions released. We don't have a report on all of the exams, but we do get a selection of questions. And so from the September and December exam sittings, we have one exam's worth of questions. So it's like a full exam, but it might not necessarily be the exam that somebody sitting actually saw. So I just wanted to look at all those questions and look at the areas that were covered, because this is a typical exam, and in the advanced tax exam, you can expect to see a real variety of subjects being tested. So from the most recent set of questions that were released, we've got ethics in question 1, and this exam covered some of the fundamental principles. So slightly unusual. It was really asking which principles had been breached by the previous tax advisors. We had a little section on capital gains tax with gift holdover relief, which comes up loads in the exam. Typical requirement asking for post-tax income. So that's one of the examiner's favourites, is asking you to work out somebody's income after all of the taxes had been paid. So that was quite a tricky bit in that question. It covered various different taxes. So it was all about somebody incorporating their business and then taking a dividend back from the company. So you had to work out how much the dividend was by thinking about the company's profits, and then work out how much tax will be due on the dividend. It involved a little bit of other taxes as well. There was some national insurance in there. So quite a mixture of different taxes in that requirement. Then we had a section on sole trader loss reliefs, which was about explaining the reliefs available, deciding between those. Some VAT. So VAT, we had the capital goods scheme and some imports, so some overseas aspects. And then there was some inheritance tax in that question as well. So that was about the death estate, and then an explanation of APR, which of course is agricultural property relief. So a real mixture in question 1, mostly involving personal taxes. And then in section B, there were 2 questions, 2 25-mark questions, as you'll always have in the exam. One of those was all about corporation tax and companies. So that covered, again, various different aspects. So we had a gain with structures and buildings allowance. There was a balancing charge. You had to work out the after-tax proceeds. So note the common theme there from disposing of those assets. There was a groups aspect. So that was about transferring an intangible asset, so a patent, within a group of companies. And then we had a little overseas aspect there as well, which was looking at setting up an overseas permanent establishment and whether or not it would be good to make an exemption election. So that one was all round companies. And then the final question, question 3, 25 marks, was individuals, and covered, again, some overseas aspects. So this time we had income tax with the remittance basis, some overseas income, and double tax relief. Then we had a little bit on share options, so specifically the EMI scheme, Enterprise Management Incentive Scheme, and also, again, with some business asset disposal relief. and a bit more inheritance tax thrown in there as well. So this time, this was about explaining some of the exemptions available, normal expenditure from income and the annual exemption, and what further information might be required. So as you can see from that, we have a real mixture of topics. And one of the things that the examiners always say is that to do well in this exam, you need to have, obviously it's a very technical exam, you need to have a good knowledge of the UK tax system. And in particular, your brought forward knowledge from the TX exam is very important as well. So just from those questions that we've just mentioned that have been released from the most recent sittings, we have things like loss reliefs for individuals. So all of that is from TX, basic income tax computations, basic capital gains computations, basic corporation tax, things like capital allowances, structures and buildings allowances. All of those are actually areas that would have been covered in the TX exam, and they're still tested in the advanced tax exam as well. So the only difference really in the advanced tax exam is the way that they're tested, which will tend to involve things like working out the proceeds after tax rather than just calculating the tax, and also explaining is going to be really important too. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what is going to be tested in the exam. So I can see already somebody's asked a question. Do we know if question 1 will always be on personal tax? Absolutely not, unfortunately. We don't know what the questions are going to be. So pretty much anything can get tested anywhere in the exam. The only thing that we do know is ethics. But what I've done is to pick out some of the things that you really do need to know. So these are things that get tested, not in every exam, but do get tested very regularly. And these are also areas that the examiners have highlighted that get tested that people don't generally know quite well enough. So particularly loss reliefs for individuals and for companies are very regularly tested. So from that September-December exam, we've got loss reliefs for individuals in question 1. So sometimes we see loss reliefs for companies, sometimes we see both. So you need to make sure that you know the rules and that you know the detail for those. An area that's very often neglected is VAT. So this is something that the examiners specifically mentioned in the report. VAT is often overlooked and it will be tested. So some of the areas that are particularly relevant that get tested very frequently, land and buildings and the capital goods scheme. So the capital goods scheme was one that was in the September-December questions. Partial exemption for VAT. So this is a new area in the advanced tax exam that gets tested fairly regularly as well. And imports and exports also come up quite a lot. So we had imports in that last sitting. Capital gains tax reliefs. So these are, apart from incorporation relief, these are all ones that you've seen in your TX studies, but they get tested really, really frequently as well. So you need to know about rollover relief, which is the one that could be for people as well as companies. The other ones are all just for individuals, business asset disposal relief, gift holdover relief, incorporation relief, and private residence relief. So all of those are regularly tested, and be prepared to explain them. So you need to know the conditions, you need to spot when those apply, and you need to be able to explain why they apply, as well as being able to do calculations. Inheritance tax reliefs. So inheritance tax is another tax that it is a little bit tricky, and there's no guarantee, but we often see round about 15 marks in the exam on inheritance tax. So you need to be prepared for that as well. So particularly business property relief and agricultural property relief, which are the two key reliefs. Those are one of the new areas, the reliefs in the advanced tax exam. So be prepared to explain about those reliefs and whether or not they apply. And the other thing that we often see is overseas aspects. So overseas aspects of personal tax, which was in that last exam, and the residence and domicile rules, and also the implications of those. So from this previous sitting, we have the remittance basis, quite tricky. So you need to know when that applies, be prepared to explain the implications of those. How are they going to impact on somebody's tax? Now, one thing, unfortunately, that I can't tell you is whether those will come up in your exam. So a bit of a disclaimer here. I haven't seen the exam, sadly. I don't know what's going to come up in March, but these are just some areas that are regularly tested that you really, really do need to make sure that you learn. Okay. So there are so many rules, aren't there? One of the questions that I often get asked is, okay, how on earth do we remember all of these rules? So it's up to you. People like to remember them in different ways. Mind maps can be very useful. So for example, you might say, right, okay, corporation tax, what goes into the corporation tax computation, all the different types of profits, how do I calculate those? Can I remember that? Think about where losses fit into the computation and try to get a picture in your head of how everything fits together. If I give away an asset, which taxes might be relevant? Oh, I've got capital gains tax, I've got inheritance tax, and think about how those fit together as well. So you might find that drawing mind maps helps you to try to understand how everything fits together. Some people like to prepare flashcards. So flashcards can be really useful for testing yourself on things like the conditions for the capital gains tax reliefs, for example. So, you might say, right, business asset disposal relief, what are the conditions? And then test yourself, pop them on the back of a flashcard. You can do it electronically now, I think, can't you? In these days of smartphones, we've got things like mnemonics, which you might find useful. So, for example, the ethical principles form the word OPIC, O-P-P-I-C, and then you just have to remember what they all stand for. So you might find that those are useful. Sometimes people like to make up stories. So, okay, you make up a story that covers all of the things that you need to remember. One thing that's really important is that in the exam, you're going to have to explain. So you need to practice doing that. And one thing that I like to do, my family hates me, but I like to try to explain the rules to my friends and family. So, things like, well, what happens if you give something away? How does inheritance tax work? And if you try explaining that, then that will really test whether you do actually know those rules. Write them down. So, can you write down all of the conditions for all of the capital gains and inheritance tax reliefs? So one thing that is quite easy to do and easy to get wrong is just you read it, don't you? You read and think, oh, yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that. But do you really know it? So test yourself. You've got to test yourself and you need to be practicing questions, okay? So it's really, really important that you do practice questions, test yourself, make sure that you do actually know the rules and that you can explain those rules, apply those rules. Now, the one thing that we do know is going to come up in the exam is ethics. So this is the only guaranteed topic in the advanced tax exam. It's 5 marks, but 5 marks is quite a good chunk. And if you're prepared for this, you should hopefully be able to score 5 out of 5 on this section. So it's always going to be in question 1 for 5 marks. And there are various areas that will be tested. So apart from the actual ethical principles, which you need to know, which is what we had in that question that was released from the most recent sitting, you need to be prepared to write about prospective clients, so new clients, things like what information do we need, what are the procedures, conflicts of interest, very, very common. So can we act for 2 conflicting clients, the buyer and the seller, husband and wife? Are there any sort of procedures we need to put in place for that? Things like disclosing information to HMRC and what happens maybe if you have a client who says, I don't want to tell them about this. What do you do? Money laundering, so that could impact on a number of these different areas. So be prepared to briefly explain the procedures there. How do you deal with tax irregularities? What's the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion? So the best way to learn all of these is to look at as many past exams as possible and look at those ethics sections. And there is also a really useful article which you'll find on the ACCA website all about the ethical areas that could be tested in the exam, which gives you lots of examples as well. But make sure that you're prepared for that, because that's the only thing that is definitely going to come up in the exam. So practicing questions, looking at past exams is going to be really, really important. And the examiners have said that you should note the style and presentation of model answers. So when you're answering an exam question, have a look at the model answer, look at what was written there. And particularly in the more recent exams, you'll find that they are quite brief. You don't need to write lots in this exam. It's a tax exam. We don't want huge essays, nice short sentences, and keep it simple, keep it brief. Focus on spotting clues in questions. So I'll give you a little example of this in a second, but this is what you'll get from practicing questions. When you look at the answer, just think, well, how did they know to write about that? And you can guarantee that there will be some sort of clue in the question. There will also be guidance in the question, particularly for the big question in section A. Often there will be quite a lot of notes that will give you some tips on what to do. So it will tell you where to start. It will give you some guidance on maybe the stages that you'll need to go through. And that's not there to trip you up, that's there to help you. So if the question gives you some guidance, do what it says. So just a little example of spotting clues. So this is from one of those questions in the most recent exam. So we've got a question that involved working out the gain on the sale of a building. And it didn't specifically say that structures and buildings allowances had been claimed, but the clue that was in the question, and this is one that's really commonly used, if it says something like the company claims all available allowances. So you then will need to think, okay, what allowances could be available? So this is a building, it's a newly constructed office building. Aha, so I know they must have claimed structures and buildings allowances. So those are the kind of clues that you need to pick up from a question that will then give you a hint when you come to answer that question. Typically, another one that we'll get is that a person maybe claims all possible reliefs. So again, if they say that, then that means that there is definitely some sort of relief that could have been claimed. So you then need to think, okay, what relief could they have claimed here? And make sure that you deal with that in your answer. So look out for clues, and the best way is to practice questions, because then you'll start to learn the language that's going to be used that will give you the hint that you'll need to answer that question. Really, really important in the exam that you address the requirement. So read the requirement, read it twice, read it 3 times, make sure that you are actually answering the question that has been set. And for this exam, there are no marks for something that's not been asked for. So for example, if the question just asks you for capital gains tax implications, there will not be credit given if you've said, oh, there might be some inheritance tax implications later on as well. If the question doesn't specifically ask you to give the date that the tax is due, then although that might be correct, they won't generally give credit for that. So unless the question was a little bit more open, where it just asked you for the implications, if it doesn't ask you for a date, then you don't need to bother giving a date. And look very carefully as well at the command words in the question. Most of the questions in the advanced tax exam will use some of these words that we've got here. So we have explain. So explain means words. Advise, again, just a very similar, means using words as well. And advise very often is linked then with a conclusion. So advise on which of these is best, which is the best option, say. So that will need some words as well. So if you're asked to explain or advise, it's very important that you do produce a written answer. Calculate means do some numbers. If the requirement just says calculate, then you don't need to explain as well. Now, often it will say to explain with calculations or calculate with explanations, in which case you need to do both. But if it just says calculate, then you can just do numbers. And as long as those numbers are easy to follow, so they need to be labelled, then that's all that will be required. And particularly, look for matters that it says should not be covered. So often it will say ignore VAT or ignore national insurance or do not consider carrying the loss forwards. And if it tells you not to do something, then don't do it. Now, although you won't actually lose marks if you cover something that it didn't ask you to cover, it will waste time, and the exam is quite time pressured. So doing things that you're not asked to do is going to waste time. And also that's something that they might be looking for in the professional skills. So for this exam, 20% of the exam is professional skills, and something that they'll be looking for, I think particularly in question 1, which is where communication will be tested, is have you followed the instructions? And if they've said not to cover something, then there will usually be a professional skills mark if you followed that instruction and done as you were told. So matters that shouldn't be covered, it's important that you don't cover those. A, you'll waste time, and B, it might mean that you don't score the professional skills mark. Look at the number of marks as well. So that's going to be really important if you've got, say, a written section in a question, to give you guidance as to how much you need to write. So sometimes we see similar requirements, but for different numbers of marks. And the number of marks is generally going to tell you how many points you need to make as a very rough guide. So if it's, let's say, an ethics section, which we know is going to be worth 5 marks, usually for that ethics section, there will be 1 mark per good relevant point. So look at your answer, make sure that you have written 5 different things there, 5 separately identifiable points. And there might be more marks available. So for the ethics section, sometimes we have 6 marks available with a maximum of 5, and that will be capped. So if it's 5 marks on ethics, you could not score 6 marks, even if there were 6 marks available. So look at the number of marks and make sure that you don't overwrite or underwrite. So, you know, if it's 12 marks and you've got 3 points, then you haven't written enough. If it's 3 marks and you've got 12 points, you've probably written too much. So just to give you a little example at a requirement. So this is, again, one from the most recent exams that the questions that were released. And this section of a question was all about after-tax proceeds. So what it said was to calculate, with supporting explanations, this company's after-tax proceeds from the sale of an office building and movable machinery. It says specifically to ignore value-added tax and stamp duty land tax, and it's 7 marks. So before you start that part of the question, you know that you're going to be doing some numbers and you need to provide some explanations. Now, in the exam, of course, you will have the spreadsheet and the Word document available for all of the questions. So the way that I would usually approach the questions in the advanced tax exam, I always like to start in the Word document and then refer to the spreadsheet if I've put some numbers in there. So what I would be thinking here is I'll probably do the numbers in the spreadsheet because it's much, much easier there. I can use formulae, it's all nicely set out in columns. But the words I would usually want to do in the word processor document, because writing in the spreadsheet is really clunky. And although you can put words there, it's really difficult to format. And if you've missed something out, you know, you can't just insert lines like you can in the Word document. So I would always be wanting to put my words in the Word document. And then if I've got numbers, then I'd usually cross-reference and put those in the spreadsheet. You don't have to do it like that. So I've often been asked, will I get penalised if I don't put my calculations in the spreadsheet, or will I get penalised if I put words in the spreadsheet? No, you won't, but you'll just find it easier to do the words in the Word document and the numbers in the spreadsheet. The markers will look at both. So don't worry, don't be frightened that they won't see it. So they will be looking in both places. But if you can help them by cross-referencing, that really helps as well. So in the Word document, see Excel, do your numbers in there, and then put the right written explanations in the Word document. Follow the instructions. So if it says after tax proceeds, that means that we want the proceeds figure, not the gain, the proceeds less the tax. So you need to work out the tax, and then whatever your tax figure is, deduct that from the proceeds. And that final mark will be a nice, easy own figure rule mark. Ignore VAT and stamp duty. So make sure that you do that. There's no need to consider those. And for 7 marks, where it's calculations and explanations, it's probably going to be roughly an even split between the two. Not always, but you can probably get about half of the mark for the words and half for the numbers. Okay. And for 7 marks, you want to make sure that, you know, you've got roughly 7 different things going on in your answer. Another thing that the examining team has said is don't bother providing general explanations or long introductions. So sometimes I think, particularly if a question asks for a report, there is a temptation to start with a nice sort of introductory paragraph. Well, don't bother. They won't give you credit for that. To, from, date, subject, pop in your heading, straight in with your answer. That's what we need. Explanations, if requested. So I've already said, if it says to calculate, we don't need you to explain as well. Think before you write. So, you know, look at what the question's actually asking. Make sure that you apply your knowledge to the facts and don't write about things that are not relevant. So, you know, think which taxes are going to be relevant here, which points are relevant, and just make sure that you specifically answer the question. So if you have, again, just looking at another one, so this was a question about the EMI scheme, where it says, again, explain with supporting calculations. So we need words for the explaining, calculations for the numbers. Sometimes if it's supporting calculations, you might find that there's not quite so much, so you might be able to do those in the Word document as well. And if you do that, then there is a table that you can insert, which makes it look nice and neat. And we want the tax consequences of exercising these share options and also selling the shares. So if it says tax consequences, then you need to be thinking, well, what taxes could actually apply here? It says to ignore national insurance, so we can forget that. So the ones we might need to think about are income tax and capital gains tax. So that might give you a professional skills mark if you've actually identified which taxes are relevant where it doesn't specifically say. And it says to identify with reasons the capital gains tax relief that might be available on the sale of the shares. So identify with reasons, you need to spot the relief, sale of shares, almost certainly that's going to be business asset disposal relief. And with reasons means I want to see in your answer the word because or as. So why are we going to get something? And why is a very common requirement. And if it asks you why, then you need to say because. So the relief will be available because, and then you need to make sure that you make it clear that you know the conditions. So business asset disposal relief, what are the conditions? Oh, we need to be an employee. So it's available because Danny was an employee. How long do we have to do that? Oh, 2 years. So don't just say because Danny's been an employee for 5 years. The rule is 2 years. So make sure that you state that in your answer. So make sure that you apply your knowledge, use the information from this scenario. Don't just write out all of the conditions, pick the ones that are relevant. And the sneaky point here for the EMI scheme is that you don't actually have to have owned the shares for 2 years. It just has to be 2 years from the date of granting, which was a bit sneaky. Think before you start. Make sure that you manage your time. So these are all bits of advice, again, from the examiner's report. I'll talk about allocating time in a second. So allow the correct amount of time for each question part. So you do need to make sure that you spend enough time on all of the questions in the exam. Think about the issues before you write. So don't just launch straight in, think very carefully. And the examiners say to identify the points that you're going to address and the strategy you're going to adopt. So the way that I would normally start a question is to use the requirement as headings. So break that down into headings. And I try to think about, what are the points that will be relevant? So say from that last question, business asset disposal relief, we've got the employee thing, we've got the length of ownership, and just jot down a few key points, BADA, employee, and then you can gradually fill that out. And the strategy that you're going to adopt, you might need to think, well, am I going to do this in the Word document? What am I going to put in the spreadsheet? Think about how you're going to break your answer down and the areas that you're going to cover. And again, looking at the number of marks is going to help you. And managing your time. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but in the exam, you've got 3 hours and 15 minutes in total. I would normally recommend spending about 15 minutes reading through at the start. So just getting a rough idea of which question you might want to begin with. You know, if you've seen the first question and thought, oh my God, I hate all of those topics, I haven't revised capital goods scheme, I'll start with question 2. So spend 15 minutes having a quick look through. You've got 80 technical marks and 20 professional skills marks. Now, you shouldn't be actually allocating time to the professional skills marks. Those should be picked up as you go along if you have a good go at answering the questions. So you've got 3 hours, you've got 80 technical marks, so that works out at 2.25 minutes per mark. So if it's a 7-mark section, then you do 7 times 2.25, which I can't do in my head and I haven't got a calculator, work out how long that is, and then set out what time you've got to finish. And that's where the scratch pad can be quite useful in the exam. So you've got your scratch pad, you just jot down what time do I need to finish this. Make sure that you do keep looking at the clock and stop when your time is up. So it's really difficult in this exam, especially if you're a good student, you know loads of stuff, you just think, oh, I just want to say a few more things. Don't, because you will be capped. There will be more marks available for some sections than you can possibly get, and they will cap you. So once your time is up, stop that part of the question and move on. Make sure that you get all the obvious, the easy marks, things like conclusions. If you have been asked for a date, make sure you give that date. Get all of the easy marks. If there's anything you're not sure of, just have a go. If you put something, you might score something. If you write nothing, you will score nothing. So have a go, but get the easy marks, and remember that you only need 50% to score a pass, and you should be able to get 50% in the exam. There are always going to be some tricky bits, but you should be able, hopefully, to score at least half of the marks if you do this. And you've got to practice. So practice doing questions to exam time. Show your workings. So very important, because if you get something wrong early on, so let's say that you've worked out the gain incorrectly, that means the tax will be incorrect, which means the after-tax proceeds will be incorrect. But if I can see that you've used the right method, then you will still score marks for the remaining bits of the question. So if you've used your figures in the correct way, and if the marker can see that you've done that, then you'll be given credit. So always show the method that you're using. Now, one thing I would say as well is that in the spreadsheet, you can obviously use formulae in the cells, and the marker will be able to look into the cells to see those formulae, but, you know, make their life easy. Don't do a whole income tax computation in one cell. Split it down, make it nice and easy to see. And it does help the marker as well if you just put down things like, you know, what rates of tax you're applying, so that they don't have to look in every single cell, because then they might miss things. The marker is a human and is getting probably paid by the script. So the easier you make their life, the more likely you are to score a good mark. So show the method that you're using. Make sure that it's nice and easy to follow. And own figure rules will be given. So you should only be penalised once for any mistake that you make. They don't take marks away, but if you get something wrong, obviously you won't score for that section, but you could then get marks if you've followed that through and used your figures correctly for the rest of the question. A few other pointers from the examiner's report. So these are just things that I picked up as I was looking through. Very important to be specific. Some of the examples that the examining team gave were people losing marks by not being specific enough when they were describing losses. For a sole trader, we can get relief against total income in the current year and or the previous year. So the words and or were often missing. If you're talking about groups of companies, be specific. Don't just say it's a group. Don't just say it's a 75% group. It's a 75% gains group. So they were specifically looking for that in that most recent exam. If you're leaving something out on purpose, then say so. So for example, overseas property was excluded from the death estate. If you didn't actually say that, then they might just think that you'd forgotten it. So make sure that you do specify if you're leaving something out deliberately. And if the question asks you for a conclusion, put a conclusion, because that will be very easy marks. And as long as your conclusion is supported, so you can't just say option 1 is best and expect to get a mark if you haven't done any any sort of calculations or analysis. But if your conclusion is supported by your analysis, you'll get credit for the conclusion. So those are all things from the examiner's report, things that you can take on board while you're practicing questions. And what I want to do now is to have a quick look at the study hub and how that might help you in your exam studies and how you might use that, say, while you're practicing questions. So because my internet is sometimes a little bit flaky, what I've done is to record a short video demonstrating how the study hub might be useful, give you a few tips on how that might help you. So this is going to be a video that will play in a separate media window. So I will set this off for you now.
So you're looking at a question, and this is question 1 from the September-December 2024 exam. And before I start this question, I can see that there are a couple of things in here that I'm not too sure about. So for example, this question covers reliefs in respect of a trading loss of an unincorporated business. Maybe I'm a bit shaky on the loss reliefs. And also VAT for the capital goods scheme. Capital goods scheme was not something that we covered in class. It's an area that I was supposed to home study. Oops, and I forgot to do that. So this is where you might find the study hub really useful. So before I start this question, I'm going to go into the study hub. And I have here all of the chapters in the study material. So I can just look through those chapters. So for example, if I want to find sole trader losses, there isn't actually a chapter specifically on losses here, but I can see that there is one for an unincorporated business. So let's see what's in there. And within there, scrolling down, I have trading loss for new and ongoing businesses. So I might just want to run through that section on trading losses. I'll find some notes, some summaries, details about the options available. And you need to make sure that you know these, although these are from the TX exam. As we've said, the TX material is still really important. We've got a nice pro forma here just to remind me about where the losses go. A reminder about planning, so that might be really important in this question. So if you're having a go at a question, a past exam question, and you see a technical area that you're not sure of, then have a look in the study hub. The other thing that you can do as well, if you can't immediately see where to find something, is use the search option. So if I search, let's say, for loss relief, well, because there are lots of types of losses, that actually brings up quite a lot of results. So I could filter those, see which sections those are in. Some of these might be losses for companies, but this will show me where these might appear in the study material. And the other thing that this is really useful for is for searching questions. So on the study hub in the practice section, we have got some questions. So the questions, section A and section B questions, but because the questions in the advanced tax exam are multi-tax questions, I can't actually see what these questions cover. Now, ideally, you want to be practicing as many questions as possible, but if, let's say, you wanted to try to find a question that covered some loss reliefs, then if we go back to our search, you can actually filter the search results so that it shows you questions. So that might help you to identify where a topic has actually come up in one of these questions. So here we have 3 questions that clearly involve some loss relief. Going back to the question that I was looking at, so question 1, the other area that I wanted to revise was VAT for the capital goods scheme. Again, I can go to the study hub, and in the study hub there are 2 chapters on VAT, value added tax. So I could just have a look through those chapters, or again I could use the search function. And it's actually in the further aspects of VAT that I will find the capital goods scheme. And you'll notice if you just look down the headings here that there are a couple of topic explainer videos, so you will find some of those spread out amongst the study material as well. And the examiners have stated that VAT is an important area for the exam, particularly the capital goods scheme and some of the other aspects that we've got here. Partial exemption, very important. Land and buildings gets tested regularly as well. So as you're practicing questions, which should be your main focus between now and the exam, remember that if you do come across a technical area that you're not sure of, then you can have a look at the study hub. And if you want to find more questions covering a particular area, then the search function in the study hub can be really useful as well. The other point to note about the study hub, which is really, really important if you're doing a tax exam, is that it uses the correct Finance Act for your exam. Here, this version of the study hub is one that is specifically for exams from June 2024 to March 2025. So there will be a new version for the June sitting, which will be based on the Finance Act of 2024, but your exam in March 2025 is based on the Finance Act of 2023. So you know that all of the information, all of the questions that feature are going to be based on the correct Finance Act. So that's particularly important if there are any of you who are resitting the exam maybe, who have older material, or perhaps if you've deferred a few times and haven't updated your material, then you know that this material is definitely in the correct Finance Act, so it would use all of the rules that are examinable for your exam.
Okay, so hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea of how the study hub might be useful to you. So you've got technical content there, it's all in the right Finance Act, you can search for things, and there are some extra questions there as well. So what should you be doing now then? Between now and the exam, what can you do to improve your chances of passing? One of the most important things that you need to be doing is practicing questions using the software. So use the practice platform. It's really important that you get used to using the word processor, the spreadsheet function, and there are lots of resources on that practice platform. So you've got practice exams, there are past exams, but if you're doing the past exams, just make sure you're doing the ones that are in the correct Finance Act. And also there's a blank workspace area. So even if you're practicing other questions, so you might have, a revision question bank, say, you can use that to practice. So you've got to get used to using the software. It's no good just practicing questions, you need to be learning from them as well. So once you've had a look at a question, look at the answer, be critical, look at your answer. Did you miss things? Have you actually written down everything you thought you'd written down? So if you find that you're not doing very well, it might be that you're missing out on some of the more obvious points. So, have you actually gone straight to the conclusion without writing down all the steps first? And by practicing questions, that's the best way to find where your weaknesses are. So have a go at a question, and then if you find that there was something that you couldn't do, go back and look at that area, learn that area. Make sure that you've got your TX knowledge back up to speed as well. So, all the basic computations, the examiner said in the report, some people didn't know how to work out tax on dividends. That's really key stuff that you need to know. And use those resources, use all the resources that are on the ACCA's website. They are there to help you. You'll find lots of technical articles, as well as obviously the past exams, examiners' reports and guidance. For those of you who are resitting, if you're resitting, then obviously you need to know what you can do to pass this time. So I think really it depends on how low your mark was. And what the examiners have generally said is that if you scored 40 something, then it's probably just an exam technique issue. So it might be that maybe you're not managing your time correctly. So if you're fairly close to a pass, then it's more a case of just sort of practicing and maybe tweaking your time management. If you're scoring sort of in the low maybe 20 to 30, then it's probably a lack of knowledge. So you need to make sure that you identify where your knowledge is weakest and work to improve that. Practicing questions obviously is going to be really important. And it is often by practicing questions that you find where your gaps are in your knowledge. So time management, just have a look, have a go when you're practicing questions. Was it that you didn't answer the question? So look at your answer compared to the model answer. Did you write too much? If you're running out of time, it might be that you've written too much, you haven't been specific. Have you gone the other way? Were you not writing enough? Make sure that you get the professional skills marks. So you should pick those up as you answer the questions, but things like the communication marks, simple things like using headings, making sure that you write it in a memo style, make sure that you answer all parts of the questions, address the ethical issues, those nice easy 5 marks, and again, use the resources to help you. Okay. So we have some time now for some questions and answers, and I'm having a look. Have I got some questions here? Let me just move my screen. Let's see what we've got coming in. Yes, I think hopefully I have just answered some of these. So a question here about resitting, scored in the low 30s. What's the best way to structure the remaining days and cover gaps in my knowledge? So if you're in the low 30s, then that suggests to me that you do have some gaps. So I think the first thing to do will be to recognise where those gaps are. And so you probably know, don't you? I think everybody really knows, oh, I'm not very good at this. Maybe did you look at the VAT areas? Do you know your capital gains tax reliefs? All of those things that I said you really must know. Make sure that you know all of those and practice questions to find where you've got gaps. And if you find that there is a gap, then go back to the material and make sure that you actually revise the material so that you could answer that question. And repeat questions as well. So if you find that you've had a go at a question and you didn't do very well, then have another go at it. And hopefully you'll find that the second time round, you'll find it much easier. Question here, if the question says explain but not calculate, do we need to include figures in our answer? That's a very good question. If it says explain, then sometimes there will still be some numbers, and usually those numbers are to give you an idea that maybe, you know, just maybe that somebody has made a profit, or it might be that the numbers show you that the person has made a loss. So you don't actually need to include calculations if it's just explain, but if there are figures provided, then usually they will expect you to refer to those in some way. So, you know, the figure might say, tell you that the individual is a higher rate taxpayer, or it might tell you that a gain has been made or a loss has been made. And so refer to them, but you won't need to do detailed calculations if it just says to explain. Okay, so a question here. Whenever I'm doing questions, I spend too long with thinking time. How can I prevent this to not waste time in the actual exam? Well, I think really the only way that you can improve on that is by more practice. So the first time you see a question, it probably is going to take you quite a long while to work out what's going on. The more questions you practice, the more similar questions you'll see, and the more that you will get the feel for what they're actually asking you to do. So all you can do is just to keep practicing and make sure then that that speeds you up. So it's a bit like, you know, running 5K. The first time I ran 5K, it took me about a week, but with practice, I did get a bit faster. And it's the same idea with exams. So the more you practice, the easier it gets. Good question here. Yes, the conclusion marks. Do you still get awarded marks for the wrong conclusion if it's supported by your calculations? Absolutely. So as long as your conclusion is supported, then you will get credit for that. So if they were, say, asking you which option is best based on after-tax proceeds, as long as you've got a figure for after-tax proceeds for the two options, say, and you've said option 1 is best as it gives you more after-tax proceeds, and if you've backed that up, you will get credit for that conclusion. The only time that you wouldn't get credit for a conclusion is if you have no kind of evidence. So If you don't have any kind of backup, then they're not going to give you credit. But as long as you've backed that up, then that's absolutely fine. Yes. Okay. Another good question here. Is doing question 2 or 3 first a good approach rather than doing question 1? So that is a really good question, actually. Which order should you do the questions in the advanced tax exam? And yeah, I can see some thumbs up there. So a few of you are probably thinking that. The answer is, it's up to you. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is, first of all, that you attempt all of the questions. So it doesn't matter what order you do them in. I would always do the one that I was most confident in first, because I would look through and think, oh, no, don't like that, don't like that, don't like that. Which one do I not like the least, sort of thing? Do my best question first, just to give me a bit more confidence. But the key thing is that you do all of the questions. You must have a go at all of the questions, allocate your time. Sometimes I think question 2 and 3 are a bit more straightforward because you've got the requirements just at the end of the question. So all in the requirements button on the screen. So, you know exactly what you're being asked to do, which is nice. Whereas for question 1, obviously, you've got the email from the manager, which sets out all the detail of the requirements. So because they're slightly more technical, there's not quite as much to do. You might prefer to start with question 2 and 3. However, you need to go through all the questions. And so, you've got to do question 1 at some point. It's half of the exam. And so this is where it's really important that you do practice and make sure that you have a go at a mock exam, have a go at past exams, have a go at the practice exams. And mock exams are particularly good because it means that you can practice a whole exam all in one go to exam time. Okay. And a question here, is there any allowance, oh, that's a good question, on being close to a date in the exam? So would you be marked down if you put January 2024 instead of 31st of January 2024? I think quite possibly yes. So some dates in the tax exam are very specific. For example, if you were giving somebody the date for submission of the self-assessment form, then that is the 31st of January following the end of the tax year. If you're advising on when inheritance tax is due, it's 6 months from the end of the month of death. So it is possible that if you didn't give the exact date, you may be penalised for that. Yes, tax is very, very specific. We've already seen from the examiner's comments things like if you're writing about groups, you've got to say 75% gains group. So there's probably a half for the 75%, a half for if you've specifically said gains group. So I would always be as specific as possible. Okay. So yes, I would say be specific. And the other thing is, if you're giving dates, don't just give the rule. So don't just say the tax has to be paid by the 31st of January following the end of the tax year. Say what date that is. So dates, yep, be specific would be my advice. Question here about settling nerves. Yeah, it is really difficult, isn't it? What's the best way to settle your nerves so you can actually focus and use time wisely? So keep some sort of perspective on this. Make sure that you take breaks, have a go at questions, have some time off. Don't get too bogged down with it, and just be confident in your abilities. You know that you know your stuff. You know that you can pass. The more you practice, the easier it gets. So just take a few deep breaths, calm yourself down. You know that you can pass. So go ahead and do it, okay? Allocate your time. Stop when you get to the end of the time. And remember, you only need 50%, okay? Question here. If you forget to put the currency pounds in your calculation, is there a markdown for that? I would say absolutely not. So in the tax exam, certainly the UK tax exam, all the figures will be in pounds. Sometimes I think people have keyboards that don't do the pound sign, which is fine. So you're not going to get penalised if you don't put a pound sign, as long as you've actually worked in the correct figures. So, if you've worked to the nearest pound, then that's fine. But you don't need to actually show the currency sign to get the credit in the exam. That's not really something that they're going to be too bothered about. We're also not too bothered about spelling, grammar. You're not going to get marked down if you can't spell. As long as they can understand your answer, then you won't be penalised for that either. Okay.